Lecture 33, Enlightenment, Root and Branch Attack on Reformation Orthodoxy. 1, as Scripture says, we wrestle not against flesh and blood. The devil's struggle against the Christian is so subtle and formidable that it would deceive, if that were possible, the very elect, is what the Scripture teaches us. It's a rather interesting thing that liberals very rarely believe in devils, but that one of the arch-liberals of modern time, the late Paul Tillich, came to the conclusion that there was so much evil in the world it couldn't be accounted for by men only. And you could see he was becoming rather sympathetic with the idea that there may be a devil. Now, of course, judging from his theology, he would have been one of the ranking archangels in that particular hierarchy, but for the most part, liberals don't believe in devils, but this particular liberal seemed to have accepted the idea. Certainly anybody who believes in the Bible knows there are devils and knows that they are formidable foes, and that though they are chained in everlasting darkness, they are inescapable from the wrath of God. They nevertheless are, at this present stage in the world's history, permitted by God to influence us, and we are commanded by God to be on our guard against Satan, who's like a ravenous lion seeking to devour whom he can. Number 2, sometimes the Prince of Darkness becomes very bold, attacking the Church of God not only subtly, but by brazen, open, arrogant, direct attack on the very Word of God. I think this describes, number 3, the so-called Enlightenment of the 18th century especially. There was activity in the 17th century, and of course it went on to the 19th century. In a very real sense, I think I can say, the Enlightenment mentality dominates the century in which we live, but the Enlightenment proper, when it first came on with full vigor and had made its most obvious and direct attack upon the church, and its greatest initial influence was in the 18th century, and that's the reason we usually think of it that way. It's a rather odd thing that in the 19th century, and it's becoming so again in the 20th century, that Enlightenment thinking began in Germany and moved to the rest of Europe, and by 20 or so years later had arrived in America, and its liberal influence felt here. The original Enlightenment was not that way. It's traceable to deism in England. That's where we have the first gradual outbreak of the Enlightenment mentality and a very formidable and unmistakable attack on the Anglican and Christian Church in general. And then it moved to France and the lowlands and into Germany as what was called the Aufklärung, where it had its major development. But it's interesting to note that it began probably in England, and as I say, then German scholarship took the lead in this sort of thing. And well, on this matter of German scholarship, German thinkers aren't any better than French and American and English thinkers, I don't think, as a class. But they have an educational system over there that is more effective for the production of scholars than the American system seems to be, or at least as results determine. They usually separate between the scholarly young students and the more practical types of ones, and early in the academic course, those who are going to be the academicians are set aside, and they are trained in the basics, the languages, sciences, mathematics, and so on. Consequently, in the theological world, when they arrive there, they're well furnished with Greek and Hebrew and all the techniques of scientific research. And even in the seminary, they do a higher level of work than we do over here. They don't usually keep to a weekly schedule. Students don't have to take exams very much until the final exams, at which time the vast majority of the students flunk and have to take it over again. I remember when I started to teach in seminary in 1950, after a long visit to Zurich, Switzerland, which is German-oriented and speaking and all, I said to the students, I'd rather like to use the German method myself. I'd rather like to lecture and require you very heavy, exacting demands, not weekly assignments or anything else. You just know that 3 years from now you're going to be asked this, that, and the other thing in a very thorough examination. But I said, I couldn't get away with it. You people are so used either to weekly or monthly examinations and so on, and don't think in terms of this hard driving thing to a very exhausting type of final exam, that I think what would happen if we ever experimented with that method, is we get soft-hearted professors. And instead of flunking 90% of you, probably 99% of you in this particular method at first and so on, they would say, well, these men love Christ, we need them in the ministry and so on, and the result would be you would have a far less formidable education than the one that you get in the much more elementary way in which we proceed. If you're going to do that sort of thing, you've got to do it all along the line, and you've got to be hard-boiled about it. And they were. I remember sitting in some of their classes, which they call repetitorium, and all they do is just go over detail after detail after detail, like this. Be 50 or so people sitting in there. They'd answer the questions as they could, but all sorts of minutiae that are usually buried deep in footnotes and so on. They were expected to ask. Well, that is, I think, the main reason that the Germans became leaders in the field of scholarship in general and of theological scholarship in particular. And unfortunately, instead of being champions of orthodoxy, generally, they were deep Enlightenment figures, were disseminating all sorts of error across the world. Number 4, it should be called, this Enlightenment should be called the Endarklement, because in spite of its many valuable contributions to culture, science, scholarship, and industry, it was crass naturalism, denying God and especially his saving revelation. It just simply took as axiomatic what we call naturalism. Just assumed that if there was a supernatural deity at all, he wouldn't reveal himself in a supernatural way. I think I told you, or I just came back from another hectic weekend where I think the question came up, but I don't think I ever mentioned it in this particular course. If I did, forgive me. But I remember when I was working on my doctorate at Harvard years ago under one of this type of professor. He may have been born in America, I don't know, but he was in the Old Testament. Well, one time when he was lecturing along, one of the students had the audacity to ask a question. Now, the German is usually a Schulmeister. He reads his notes word by word, and you take them word by word, and it's usually not considered proper to interrupt the professor and raise a question. But this particular student had it was not I may say, had the audacity to say, Professor, what do you do when you, in your Old Testament studies, come across a miracle narrative? Oh, Dr. Pfeiffer said, well, I skip over to the next historical part. He just assumed that the miraculous couldn't be historical. It was taken for granted. No scholar would take seriously the crossing of the Red Sea. Of course axe heads don't float. Of course you go over to the next part. You might spend a little time in wondering how that got in there, but the idea of it being a real event, that was something that an Enlightenment mind wouldn't actually entertain. And it would be a sign of stupidity if you actually did, and it'd fall into the sort of fraternity spirit. All scholars know such, and all scholars know such, and anybody who thinks so-and-so couldn't possibly be a scholar. Now, the reason that became so menacing is that these people really were good in what they know. This was a gratuitous assumption. I never gave any case for that. That'd be like Pfeiffer. We just assume that supernatural doesn't happen. Everything has a natural explanation and so on. They were rather naive in that area. But in the area, like Dr. Pfeiffer himself, he was no mean Old Testament scholar. He had a frightful amount of erudition, no question about it, well worth reading, even though most of what he read you would not agree with and so on. But you realize at the same time with a mass of 3x5 notes behind it and all that type of thing. But I'm commenting about two aspects of the Enlightenment at the present time, and this is the aspect of it which, of course, entitles it to the name Enlightenment, even from an academic standpoint. You've got to prove there can be no such thing as a miracle. These people didn't bother proving. They assumed that any knowledgeable person would know it didn't happen and let it go at that. But, of course, that's not a rational way to proceed. One philosopher said, if God exists, miracles can occur. And most people are not prepared to say God doesn't exist. And these people were, for the most part, not prepared to try to prove he didn't exist. Most of the Enlightenment figures didn't believe in the existence of a personal God, but they didn't prove there was no such thing as a personal God. Very, very difficult to get anybody to try to prove the non-existence of God. One time called me up at Rutgers University to debate with an existentialist professor on this topic, there is no God. He was an existentialist. That's a modern form of Enlightenment thinking, as it were. There is no God. And when he was in New Jersey and I was in Pennsylvania and I was calling him, I said, that's the topic you want to debate? And you are going to prove there is no God? Yes, I'm going to prove there's no God. And my job is to show you can prove that? Yeah, that's it. I went over that about 3 or 4 times because I couldn't believe the man was actually taking on himself the proof of the non-existence of God. The usual thing was to have me come and argue for the existence of God against someone who will try to show that I can't prove that God exists. That's the normal procedure, but this was a very abnormal procedure. I couldn't believe it. The reason I went over it several times, I should have had it in writing, as later events showed out, that this man was going to prove the non-existence of God. And all I had to do was show that he couldn't prove the non-existence of God. Well, you can almost guess what the end of that story was. When I got down there for the appointed night, they had that topic on the placards all over the place at Rutgers. There were 700 or 800 students in the auditorium and so on. And Professor Olson was the first one to speak because he was taking the affirmative on this negative proposition. But all he did when he addressed this particular topic was to show how difficult it was to prove the existence of God. He must have mentioned about 15 or 20 topics which militated against the existence of God. Well, when I got up to the podium, I said, for the benefit of the moderator and the whole attendance, Dr. Olson has not even addressed the subject of the debate this evening. He has not offered one argument to prove God does not exist. All he has done is listed a number of things that I would have to overcome if I were here to prove the existence of God. Now, I said, I'll do that, since he's insisted on it, but he took this topic, and you've got it plastered all over there, and the moderator was nodding like that. That is what he took upon himself to do, and I even said in that regard, I would debate Plato on that subject, only you can be perfectly sure Plato would never attempt to prove there was no God, but I was protesting from the beginning, and I protested throughout that this was being invited to play a game of ping pong, and lo and behold, you get there and you find it's tennis that the game is, and so on. And they all recognized that, and they all gave me credit for that particular point. The moderator kept saying it and all, and I was just obliging the people. They'd come out for a debate, so I couldn't say, look, I'm going home. This man's not debating the topic we have. So I dealt with it as if I had the obligation to prove there was an existing God and that these objections he had could be answered. There were so many of them, I had to talk like mad to try to keep up with the postage. What I'm trying to say is that's an Enlightenment way of thinking. It's just an assumption that there isn't any God. Naturalism, therefore, prevails, and if you do have to entertain the idea of God at all, the notion that he would supernaturally reveal himself is beyond contempt in their mind. Number 4, let me read this again. It should be called the Enlightenment because in spite of its many valuable contributions to culture, science, and industry, scholarship, it was crass naturalism, denying God, and especially his saving revelation. But what I want to remind you is we do owe a great deal to these people who worked on this particular pattern, not because that pattern was sound, but because their education was thorough and because their scientific procedure was admirable, and because they worked in areas where they weren't necessarily attacking God's existence or the existence of morality or anything like that. And in that sense, they were very, very valuable, and we appreciate that. And inasmuch as there is such a thing as the natural man and the usefulness of the natural man, even though everything the natural man does is sinful, it may nevertheless be extremely useful, and one wants to recognize that even when he calls it the endowment, because of what it's actually doing is primarily thinking God out of existence, ruling him out of our consideration, and obviously if you gain the whole world and use your soul, that is not a good bargain, and the endowment is far, far more serious than any enlightenment concerning the way the universe operates or anything like that. Number 5, the endowment was a way for man to gain the whole world and lose his soul, which didn't seem like a bad bargain to them because they'd already satisfied themselves. There was no soul, or at least no demonstrable soul, or no soul that you could actually see with a microscope or put in a beaker or in any way test in the recognized forms of scientific research. So they didn't feel too threatened when they were told that they're gaining the world and losing their own soul. But of course, if there be a soul and if there be a God, then they're making a very poor exchange when they settle for a little more information about the way the world works and have no concern at all about the future destiny of their sinful souls. Number 6, we've already seen that the natural, unlike the moral image of God, survived the fall. This made it possible for sinners to receive the common grace of God while rejecting and despising saving grace. I just came back from an apologetic weekend, and one of the things that kept coming up in the discussions from a number of people was this particular point I've just alluded to here. It gives a kind of justification for the existence of an enlightenment, even if it was of an endowment character. I was explaining to the people that according to Reformed theology, man has a natural image of God and a moral image of God. And what is meant by the natural image are the faculties of mind and will, basically. Conscience is usually considered that. And the moral image is the disposition of the heart of God and to the love of God and the service of God. And what happened in the fall was the total obliteration of this, so that man is born spiritually dead. All that he thinks and all that he does is evil continually. The thoughts and intents of his heart are only evil continually, the Scripture says. But the natural image is intact. He can still think. He can still will. He's still a human being. He hasn't lost the status of a human being, though he has lost the status of a good human being. He's devoid of a spiritual principle now. Some of the members of the conference there didn't have too much trouble with that. But when I applied it to the fact that they were able to think and they could make good investigations in various and sundry areas, because their mind was still intact, they could even grasp the Christian gospel. And they could understand your argument for it. They'll reject it because they hate God. They love the darkness. They hate the light, but they can understand the light. As a matter of fact, I pointed out they can't even hate it without understanding it. They wouldn't know what they were hating if they didn't understand it. Well, that shook the members up a good deal because they had felt that the fall really destroyed the total image of man, and that man really couldn't use his mind anymore. It was darkened and so on. And that led to this discussion of the noetic influence of sin, which means the influence on the mind, the nous, the noetic influence of sin. Many in the group were actually supposing that the influence of sin or the fall on the mind was to destroy it. So that man really was a kind of subordinate being, no longer a true human being made in the image of God. And when I was saying, no, this is intact. He's still a human being. He can still think. He may be able to outthink you 10 times. I even gave the illustration of a evangelistic service they were having in Chicago, where a Moody Institute girl was going down the aisle trying to win people to Christ, and she encountered a University of Chicago professor and engaged him in conversation. Before the conversation was over, the professor had persuaded her she didn't have a soul, and she hadn't gotten anywhere near persuading him that his soul needed salvation and so on. But as a thinker, he could use his head far better than this Christian person could. The fall hadn't destroyed his mind, it just made him hate the gospel. And it made him use his mind as much as he possibly could to destroy the gospel, outthink the gospel, and because he was pitted comparably to him, he was able to answer all objections and raise insurmountable problems, and the poor girl was left in ruins. But it was an evidence of the fact that the mind of the unregenerate can be intact, and that the influence of sin is not that it destroys the mind, but it makes the mind function in the wrong way. It makes the mind try to justify, try to condemn what is good. It's like it's like a criminal lawyer. You know full well when the mafia hire a criminal lawyer, they're going to get the best brains they possibly can. But they're going to get those best brains and pay them in 6 digits in order to justify criminality and attack any legitimate law which would militate against their wicked interests. And so they're counting on the solidity and integrity and capacity of that mind, which hasn't been destroyed by the fall. It's just that it's perfectly willing, that this heart is in love with evil and is perfectly willing to use a first-class mind for devilish purposes of vindicating evil and attacking the good. Now, with respect to the Enlightenment, these people are obviously opposed to the truth. They incline to naturalism. They're going to use their brain, which is quite impressive, in the cause of evil. Try to militate against the church and all that's true and the Reformed theology, and at the same time use their first-class brains to establish the opposite of them. You've got to recognize that is there. It's a great channel for evangelism. It's also an extremely dangerous threat to evangelism as long as these people live enamored of their evil ways. We call that common grace, as I say, because God gives this to mankind across the board, to the commonality of mankind. And generally speaking, he gives more brains to the unregenerate than to the regenerate. Not many wise are called. I thank thee, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, said Jesus, thou hast hidden these things from the wise and prudent, and revealed them unto babes, for so it was well-pleasing in thy sight. He didn't care very much about that. What God cared about the salvation of the soul. But we have to be aware of the fact that these people do have brains and that they can be useful, but their tendency will always be to militate against God and his kingdom. 7, some Reformed theologians tend to throw out the Enlightenment baby with Enlightenment wash. That is, they deny even the common grace in which the Enlightenment abounded. 8, these theologians insist that the Enlightenment destroyed the soul when it gives the world. True that the world is a gift of God in itself. The fact that sinners sell their souls for it does not make it evil, even when it comes via evil men. That is, all right, now, this person, well, here again, I don't know, only 2 minutes left here. Let me just simply say, the fact that this particular gift, music, art, literature, theology, whatever it is, comes from an evil person, evilly motivated, and so on, doesn't mean it's not a good thing, and that you can't benefit by it. That's what I mean by throwing out the baby with the wash, when your resentment to Enlightenment mentality is so great that you can't get any benefit from it. This is common grace. It's not saving grace, but it's grace. It's a favor which God does to these people that they don't appreciate and they don't accept and they don't acknowledge, but they do, and they do use it, and it's for your benefit. So recognize the grace in the commonality here, and recognize the good gift coming from evil persons. 9, the Christian should thankfully receive all the cultural benefits God gives even when God delivers them by the devil and his agents who intend to destroy our souls by them. The tendency, as I say, is you're evil. You don't believe. I want to have anything to do with you. You're not appreciating what God is giving you through them. And I know it's not easy. I know parents get very concerned about their children who study under professors like this. And it's dangerous. But the answer is not to reject it out of hand, get no benefit at all, but get what is really beneficial and thank God for it, and at the same time see that they never reach you in their wicked intention. Number 10, and finally, it is God who makes the rain to fall on the righteous and unrighteous. The righteous are blessed by all his gifts, and the unrighteous are not cursed by them, but they make them into curses. Romans 2:4, along with Matthew 5:45, are the golden texts of God's common grace. He makes his sun to shine, his rain to fall on the unrighteous, and God's forbearance is so that you may be led to repentance. Everybody ought to be born in hell. We are not born in hell. Why? We're not born in hell. We're given divine forbearance. God is withholding his wrath to a very great measure for one purpose, to give us an opportunity to be saved. All these benefits of common grace are so that we may be in a position to benefit from special and saving grace. That, I think, is the message of the Enlightenment, and I hope we can get what God gives us by them, even while we avoid to the uttermost what Satan intends through them.